Hey there, everybody. Let's take some time now to review this heart physiology review. And the first thing I want to talk about is the intrinsic conduction system. What is the intrinsic conduction system? Well, this is the figure we're going to use to look at that. So let's orient ourselves first of all. So this is a figure of the heart that's been taken in a frontal plane. So this is a frontal section of the heart. And on top of that, we have an anterior view. So this is an anterior review. This is an anterior view of the heart taken in the frontal plane. Let's orient ourselves with some features. What's this big piece of muscle right down the middle? That's the interventricular septum. What's this area of the heart right there? That's the apex. Now let's look at some chambers. And remember, this is an anterior view and you're looking at the heart in the anatomical position. So which chamber is this right there? That's the right atrium, which makes that the left atrium. That's the right ventricle, and that's the left ventricle. Okay, back to our original question. What is the intrinsic conduction system? The intrinsic conduction system is the electrical system within the heart that's going to cause the heart to contract. Vertebrate hearts are myogenic. And what that means is that the signal for the heart to contract originates within the heart itself. You can eliminate the heart from the body, take the heart out from the body, put it in aerated saline, and it will continue to beat on its own. And the reason that's the case is because it has this intrinsic conduction system. So let's label these different components. The intrinsic conduction system starts up here in the right atrium with that structure right there. What is that called? That's the SA node. And the SA node is the pacemaker. And what's going to happen is that sodium is going to slowly leak into the SA node, and it's going to cause the SA node to spontaneously fire, spontaneously depolarize, become electrically excited. And when that happens, that electrical activity spreads all throughout the atria. And so when the SA node fires, the atria pretty much become simultaneously depolarized. They become electrically excited at the same time. And that electrical event, the electrical stimulation of the atria, results in that feature right there on the ECG. And what is that feature called? That's the P wave. So the atria become electrically excited, and then almost immediately after that is when the atria contract. So maybe in this little bit of time right after the P wave occurs is when you're going to get atrial systole, contraction of the atria. Now, that electrical activity that's running all throughout the atria does not stimulate the ventricles. And the reason that's the case is because there is a fibrous skeleton called the cardiac skeleton that electrically separates, electrically insulates the atria from the ventricles. And again, what that does is it prevents this electrical activity that's spreading through the atria from getting down into the ventricles. And the reason that's the case is because we want the atria to become electrically excited and contract before that occurs in the ventricles. So all of that occurs, we get the P wave, we get atrial systole, but now that electrical signal has to get down into the ventricles. How does that do that? Well, during this atrial depolarization, that feature of the intrinsic conduction system also becomes electrically excited. What is that feature there? That's the AV node. And then that electrical activity travels from the AV node down through this nerve-like bundle called the AV bundle. And it's the AV bundle that's going to take that electrical activity from the atria and move that down into the ventricles. So it passes it through that cardiac skeleton. Then what happens is those bundles branch right there, and they travel down the interventricular septum. What do we call those branches there? Those are our bundle branches. Then those bundle branches reach the apex of the heart. And at this point, the intrinsic conduction system, these nerve-like features, distribute themselves all throughout the myocardium of the ventricles. They branch out, and their goal is to reach as much of the myocardium in the ventricles as possible. And we call this part of the intrinsic conduction system the Purkinje fibers. And when that electrical activity reaches the end of those Purkinje fibers, that's when the myocardium, the cardiac cells in the ventricles, become electrically excited. And that causes the entire ventricles, the right and the left ventricles, to become electrically excited pretty much nearly simultaneously. And that's a big electrical event. And that electrical event is represented right there on the ECG. What's that electrical event called? That's the QRS complex. And almost immediately after the ventricles become depolarized, that QRS complex, in this little space of time right about there, that's when the ventricles actually contract. That's when ventricular systole occurs. And then we get a little pause in the action. And then we have this electrical event right there, which is the T wave. And what that represents is that represents the repolarization of the ventricles. That's the ventricles resetting themselves electrically so they can be electrically stimulated again. Then some time passes. The SA node fires again, and the process repeats itself. All right, let's go and make sure we answered all these questions. What's the intrinsic conduction system? That's the electrical system within the heart that's going to cause the heart to contract. Label its components. We did that. We have the SA node, AV bundle, bundle branches, and then the Purkinje fibers. Describe the flow of electricity through the heart during one heartbeat and labels these events on the electrocardiogram below. We did that. The SA node fires, spreads all throughout the atria, which results in the P wave. Then that electrical activity gets transferred to the ventricles by stimulating the AV node, going through the AV bundle, and through the AV bundle, through that cardiac skeleton. Then it goes in the bundle branches through the Purkinje fibers. And when the Purkinje fibers become stimulated, that results in ventricular depolarization, and that results in the QRS complex. Then the ventricles electrically reset themselves. That results in the T wave, and then the process repeats itself. This is one heartbeat right here. Where do atrial and ventricular systole occur on the ACG? Well, atrial systole occurs almost immediately after the P wave. Ventricular systole occurs almost immediately after the QRS complex. And do the atria and ventricles become electrically excited at the same time? And the answer is no, because of this cardiac skeleton that insulates the atria from the ventricles. And why is this important for heart function? Well, this is important because we want the atria to become excited and contract before the ventricles. So during one heartbeat, the atria are going to contract, and that's going to be followed by ventricular contraction. And that's the most efficient way to move blood through the heart and to get the most blood pumping out of the heart, the most cardiac output. If they were all to contract at the same time, the atria and the ventricles, then it would be a really inefficient movement of blood through the cardiovascular system. Okay, let's move on. Describe the general pathway of blood flow through the heart with each heartbeat, as shown below. So what this figure is representing here is blood flow through the heart during one heartbeat. And we'll start with figure A here. And in figure A, what happens is that the atria are both filled up with blood. And what's going to happen is blood is going to move from the atria down into the ventricles. And so these first two phases right here, A and B, this represents ventricular filling, because ultimately what we're doing here is we're filling up the ventricles with blood. Blood is moving from the atria into the ventricles. Now that the ventricles are filled up with blood, what we want to do is we want to move that blood out through the systemic and the pulmonary circuits, because that's the whole goal. The goal is to pump blood out of the heart, get it through the pulmonary circuit, and also to get it through the systemic circuit. And so what happens is the ventricles contract. This is the beginning of ventricular systole. And when the ventricles contract and pressure in the ventricles goes up, that's going to send blood from the right ventricle up into the pulmonary circuit, and also from the left ventricle out through the systemic circuit. And so these two figures right here represent ventricular systole. And then the ventricles reset themselves. And that's one heartbeat. So blood moves during one heartbeat. Blood moves from the atria into the ventricles. The ventricles contract, and that shoots blood out through the different circulations. And that's the whole goal. And so with one heartbeat, we're talking about things relative to the ventricle. The ventricles fill up and the ventricles contract. What else here? What causes the heart sounds? What causes the lub-dub? So during one heartbeat, there's two sounds associated with each heartbeat. There's the lub and there's the dub. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. And so that lub-dub is occurring during these events here. So the question is, where are they occurring and what's causing them? Well, the heart sounds, both of them, are caused by the snapping shut of the valves. But the valves that are affected and cause each heart sound are different. So the first heart sound, the lub, occurs during this phase here. And what happens is that the ventricles contract, and that causes the pressures in the ventricles to spike. And when that happens, that shoots blood up against these atrioventricular valves there. So blood shoots up against the atrioventricular valves, and that causes those AV valves to snap shut. And the snapping shut of those AV valves is what causes the lub sound. Then what happens is the blood moves out through those arteries, and after the ventricles have finished contracting, they relax. So now the ventricles relax. And when the ventricles relax, the pressure in the ventricles goes way down. And what that does is it causes this blood that's moving through these arteries to rush back towards the heart. And in the pulmonary trunk, for instance, when that blood rushes back down towards the heart, the pulmonary valves fill up with blood and it causes them to snap shut. At the same time, as blood moves back down the aorta towards the heart, the aortic valve fills up with blood and it causes those aortic valves to snap shut. And the snapping shut of those semilunar valves, the pulmonary and the aortic valve, is what causes the dub sound. Moving on. Now I want to take a look at, in more detail, at some of the events that are going on during each cardiac cycle. Some of the events that are occurring with each heartbeat. And let's take a look at the variables that we're dealing with. What are we dealing with up top here? That's the electrocardiogram. That's the ECG. That's the electrical activity that's occurring with each heartbeat. What about below that? What are we looking at? We're looking at blood pressure. And specifically, we're looking at blood pressure in the left atrium, the left ventricle, and the aorta. So blood pressure on the left side of the heart. And then what are we looking at the very bottom? Down here, we're looking at blood volume. And specifically, we're looking at blood volume in the left ventricle. So again, I want to emphasize that the events that are occurring on the right and the left side of the heart during each heartbeat are the same. But in this figure, we're just going to focus on the events that are occurring on the left side of the heart. But keep in mind that the same things are going on the right side of the heart. Now, what are we looking at down on the x-axis here? We're looking at time. And if all of these events represent one heartbeat, then about how much time are we looking at down on the x-axis? Well, if you have your normal sinus rhythm going at about 75 beats per minute, then that means that the time that we're looking at on the x-axis down here is less than a second. All of these events that are occurring right here take less than a second. All right, so what I want to do is break these events down into periods of ventricular filling and ventricular systole. In this upper diagram that we just looked at, we identified periods of ventricular filling and periods of ventricular systole. And I want to use those same events to talk about the cardiac cycle in this figure. So let's start by identifying the period of ventricular filling. Where's ventricular filling occurring? Where are we going to look to find that? Well, let's look down here at ventricular volume. And this is called ESV, that's called end systolic volume, and that's the lowest volume of blood that's going to be present in the ventricles. And at this point, the ventricles start to fill up with blood. And so this entire period right here, and then it continues on over here, is ventricular filling. And how do you know this is ventricular filling? Well, the ventricles are filling up with blood. Now, within this period of ventricular filling, there's two different phases. There's a period of passive filling and a period of atrial contraction. And let's identify both of those. First of all, what does passive filling mean? Passive filling means that blood is moving from the atria into the ventricles without contraction of the heart. So blood is moving simply from the atria into the ventricles just because of pressure differences, not because the heart is contracting. And specifically, not because the atria are contracting. So this period right here represents passive filling. And as you can see, most of the blood that moves from the atria into the ventricles occurs during this period of passive filling. That means that this next little section is the period of atrial contraction. And how do you know that the atria are contracting during this time? Where are you going to look to find out where that's occurring? Well, let's look up here at the ECG. And specifically, we know it's atrial contraction because we have a P wave right there. So the P wave represents depolarization of the atria, and immediately after that, the atria contract. So atrial systole follows that P wave. So just to recap, this period right there represents ventricular filling, and we can divide ventricular filling into passive filling and atrial contraction. This portion is the passive filling, and during that time there's no contraction going on of the heart. And then following that, we have the P wave, which causes atrial contraction. So this last little part represents atrial contraction. Now, a question I want to pose to you guys is that if you have a faulty SA node, what does that mean with regards to the events of the cardiac cycle? What's not going to be happening if you have a faulty SA node? Well, if you have a faulty SA node, then you're not going to get atrial depolarization, which means that this P wave is going to be absent. But if people have a faulty SA node, then the AV node takes over and they're still able to maintain adequate cardiac output. And how does that happen? How is it that we can move an adequate amount of blood from the atria into the ventricles without an SA node? And the answer to that is because the majority of blood, more than 80% of the blood that moves from the atria down into the ventricles occurs passively without contraction of the atria. So even if your SA node isn't working, your atria are not depolarizing and your atria are not contracting, because of this passive filling, you're still getting enough blood down into the ventricles that the ventricles can pump out an adequate amount of blood into the circulation, and you can maintain adequate cardiac output. All right, all of that was ventricular filling. And the reason we want to fill up the ventricles is because we want the ventricles to contract and to shoot that blood through the pulmonary and systemic circulations. And so this next step here, the remainder of this cardiac cycle, represents ventricular systole. The ventricles fill up with blood, and then the ventricles contract. That's one heartbeat. And then they do the whole thing over again. They fill up with blood, and then they contract. So based on this diagram, how do you know that the ventricles are contracting? I want you to identify 3 different ways during this period that you know that the ventricles are contracting. And I'd like you to put these in sequential order. So what's the first way that you know that the ventricles are contracting? What causes contraction of the ventricles? Well, electricity causes contraction of the ventricles. So the first way you know this is a period of ventricular systole is because we have this QRS complex. The ventricles become depolarized, and then immediately after that, the ventricles contract. You get ventricular systole. Now, what happens when the ventricles contract? When the ventricles contract, the volume in the ventricles goes down. And when volume goes down, what happens to pressure? Pressure goes up. So a second way you can tell that this is a period of ventricular systole is looking at the pressure in the left ventricle. And look what happens. You have this huge spike in ventricular pressure, left ventricular pressure. So that's the second way that you know that the ventricles are contracting. And what's the third way? The third way you know the ventricles are contracting is because you have blood that's shooting out of the ventricles into their respective arteries. You have this huge drop in blood in the ventricles. So those are the 3 ways that you can tell. And the sequential order is, first, you have the QRS complex, which causes ventricular systole. You have the QRS complex, which causes ventricular systole. When the ventricles contract, the volume goes down and the pressure goes up. And when the pressure goes up, that causes the pressure in the left ventricle to become greater than the pressure in the aorta, and that causes blood to rush from the ventricle into the aorta. And the same thing's happening on the right side of the body. All right, next. What is stroke volume and how is it calculated? Well, stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected from each ventricle with each heartbeat. And you can find that value on the diagram. And specifically, let's look at ventricular volume. And here's our stroke volume. This is the amount of blood that's moving from the ventricles, that's moving out of the ventricles with each heartbeat. And how do you calculate that? Well, after the ventricles fill up with blood, after ventricular filling, you're left with a value called EDV. This is called end diastolic volume. And this is the maximum amount of blood that's going to be present in the ventricles. So at the beginning of ventricular systole, we have the maximum amount of blood in the ventricles, which is what we want. Then the ventricles contract, they shoot all of that blood out of the ventricles, and you're left with this low point, the end systolic volume. So all you have to do to calculate stroke volume is take the EDV, which is in this case 120 milliliters, and subtract the end systolic volume. That's 50 milliliters. And so what are we left with? We have a stroke volume of 70 milliliters. That means that with each heartbeat, 70 milliliters is moving from the left ventricle into the aorta, and 70 milliliters is moving from the right ventricle into the pulmonary circulation. And just a couple notes on this, why it's called EDV. This is relative to the ventricles, end diastolic volume. Diastole means relaxation. So this is the volume, end diastolic volume. It's the volume of blood in the ventricles after the ventricles have finished relaxing. They're end diastolic. And then the ventricles contract, and we're left with the end systolic volume, the volume of blood in the ventricles that's left after the ventricles have contracted, after systole has occurred. So EDV and ESV, diastole and systole, are both referring to the ventricles. Okay, what is cardiac output and what's the formula? The definition for cardiac output is similar to that for stroke volume, but it's a little different. It's the amount of blood ejected from each ventricle, except instead of the amount of blood per heartbeat, it's the amount of blood ejected from each ventricle per minute. And the equation for that is heart rate times stroke volume. So cardiac output is a very important measure. It's the amount of blood ejected from each ventricle per minute. And it's super important to maintain cardiac output because cardiac output maintains blood pressure. If we don't have enough cardiac output, then our blood pressure drops and we're not able to deliver blood and all the stuff that blood is carrying to the tissues of the body. And so cardiac output is something that we want to keep careful control over. Now, cardiac output, stroke volume and cardiac output are not static. They don't stay the same. There are situations where we want to increase cardiac output, increase stroke volume, and there are situations where we want to decrease it. Now, what's a situation where we would want to increase cardiac output, increase the amount of blood going out of the heart, and increase the amount of blood that we're delivering to the tissues? Well, how about a period of exercise? During exercise, the skeletal muscles are working harder, they need more oxygen, they need more glucose, they need more waste products taken away from them, and so we need to deliver more blood to those tissues per minute. So we need to increase cardiac output. And if we want to increase cardiac output, how are we going to do that? Well, let's just look at the formula. We either increase heart rate or increase stroke volume. And that's what this figure is representing down below. So this is our end goal down here. We want to increase cardiac output. How are we going to do that? We're either going to increase heart rate or increase stroke volume. Well, if we want to increase heart rate, how are we going to do that? The intrinsic conduction system sets the basic sinus rhythm, but the intrinsic conduction system cannot increase heart rate. So we have to have some external stimulus to do that. What's the external stimulus going to be? The sympathetic nervous system. And what's the sympathetic nervous system going to do? Well, here you can see some sympathetic nerve fibers that are coming down. And what are they doing? They're stimulating the SA node. And they're increasing the frequency of action potentials on the SA node. And so when you increase the stimulation of the SA node, that's going to increase heart rate. So sympathetic activity increases heart rate, and that increases cardiac output. And certainly, if you notice during a period of exercise, your heart rate goes up. The purpose of that is to increase cardiac output so we can deliver more things to the skeletal muscles. Now, another thing that we can do is we can increase stroke volume. And there's two ways to increase stroke volume. Here's our stroke volume. How are we going to do that? Well, we can either increase the amount of blood that returns to the heart, increase the end diastolic volume, or we can decrease the amount of blood that's left in the heart. We can decrease the end systolic volume. And that's what this is showing right here. We can increase EDV, also called preload, or we can decrease ESV. And we're not going to focus so much on how we increase end diastolic volume, but one of the ways is during exercise, you have these skeletal muscle pumps that return more venous blood to the heart. So that increases your end diastolic volume, increases your venous return and your end diastolic volume. But let's focus on how you decrease the ESV. How do you eject more blood from the heart with each heartbeat? Well, what you do is you cause the ventricles to contract more forcefully, and that's called increased contractility. And the sympathetic nervous system can do that. So not only does the sympathetic nervous system innervate the SA node, but you can see these sympathetic fibers that are traveling down here to the ventricles. And what are they doing? Well, they're stimulating that ventricular myocardium, and they're increasing the force that muscle is contracting. So they're increasing the force of contraction. And when you do that, you're squeezing more blood out of the heart. You're lowering the ESV. And by doing that, you increase stroke volume. Okay, let's continue with that. And we're looking at cardiac output here. And this diagram represents cardiac output at rest. So at rest, your cardiac output is about 5.8 liters per minute, 5,800 milliliters per minute. And what this is showing you is where specifically in the body that blood is going. About 750 milliliters of that goes to the brain. Some of it goes through the coronary circulation, the skeletal muscles, kidneys, and abdomen. Now, during exercise, we increase cardiac output through those increases in heart rate and increases in stroke volume. And our cardiac output goes up to about 17,500 milliliters per minute. So it almost triples. And what this figure is showing is where all of this blood is now going. So we can compare where blood goes at rest to where blood goes during exercise. So let's look at where this blood is going. Where are some places that we send more blood to during exercise? So during exercise, we have all of this extra blood, but we're not sending it evenly to all the organs in the body. We have priorities during exercise. Some organs are prioritized more than others. And what are some of those areas that are prioritized? Well, what about the heart? The amount of blood that's going to the heart triples. And why is that the case? Well, heart rate goes up, those cardiac cells are working harder, and so they need more oxygen, they need more glucose, we need to take away more CO2. And so there's about 3 times as much blood that is pumped into the coronary circulation. What's another one? Well, the big one here are skeletal muscles. We go from 1,200 to about 12,000 milliliters of blood. So the amount of blood going to the skeletal muscles goes up about tenfold. And again, that's the same reason that blood is increasing to the heart. The skeletal muscles are using more glucose, they're using more oxygen, and they need to get rid of CO2 more quickly. So we need to send more blood to that area. What are some other places? Well, we have more blood flow to the skin. And can anybody take a guess at why we have more blood flow to the skin? This has to do with temperature. So during exercise, your body temperature goes up. And so we want to send more blood to the skin to decrease body temperature. Those blood vessels that are close to the skin are able to give off heat, and it's a way that we can decrease our body temperature. Now, what are some areas of the body that are not a priority during exercise, that we actually decrease blood flow to? Well, one of those are the kidneys. We go from 1,100 milliliters down to 600. And why is that the case? What do the kidneys do? Well, the kidneys are responsible for filtering blood, maintaining blood chemistry, and producing urine as a byproduct of that. And during exercise, that's just not a priority. And so we want to deprioritize the kidneys, and the way we do that is we decrease blood flow to it. What's another one? The abdomen. Blood flow to the abdomen goes down as well. And that's along the same lines. The abdomen, the digestive viscera, is responsible for taking nutrients up, digesting nutrients and taking them up into the blood. And that's just not a priority during exercise. During exercise, we want to take blood to the organs that are doing the most work, the heart and the skeletal muscles, and the kidneys and the abdomen just do not get prioritized in that process. And the last thing that I want to talk about is blood pressure, and specifically how the body deals with low blood pressure. So first of all, why is low blood pressure a problem? Why is blood pressure in general important? Well, for blood to move through the blood vessels, move through the cardiovascular system, there has to be pressure. It's pressure that drives the movement of blood through the blood vessels. And if blood pressure is too low, then we're not going to have enough blood circulating through the vessels. And what that means is that the tissues of the body are not going to be receiving the nutrients and the gases that they need to survive. And we're not going to be able to take away the waste products. And that's bad because as a result, the tissues can become damaged and they can die. So how does the body detect that, and how does it respond to that? And that's what we're going to look at. So first of all, how does the body detect drops in blood pressure? Our blood pressure goes down. How does the body detect this? And I guess specifically, or to ask initially, what organ system is going to be responsible for detecting drops in blood pressure? That's going to be the nervous system. One of the main functions of the nervous system is to detect sensory information. And blood pressure is certainly sensory information that the nervous system is going to detect. So where do we find those sensory receptors? Well, here in the aortic arc and up here in the carotid arteries going through the neck up to the head, we have sensory receptors called baroreceptors. And what do baroreceptors do? They detect pressure. They're detecting stretch of the blood vessel wall. So when blood pressure drops, these blood vessels, the stretch in these blood vessels goes down, and that's detected by these baroreceptors. So these baroreceptors send that information through sensory neurons, and where are we going to take that? We're going to take it to the central nervous system, and specifically, we're going to take it to an area called the cardiac center that is located in the medulla oblongata, the medulla oblongata. So the nervous system does three things. It detects sensory information, and that's just what we did here. What's the next thing that it does? It integrates or it processes that sensory information. So that's going to occur in the cardiac center in the medulla oblongata. And this occurs at a subconscious level. We're not conscious of this integration. But basically, when the cardiac center receives this information, it says, okay, blood pressure is low. This is a problem. What are we going to do to fix it? That's all part of the integration process that occurs in the cardiac center. And the third thing that the nervous system does is it sends out commands through its motor division to activate effector organs to correct the problem. And what's the effector organ that we're going to use to correct this problem with blood pressure? That's going to be the heart. Remember, the effector organs for the nervous system can be skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular tissue. So we're going to stimulate cardiac muscle here. So the cardiac center sends out stimulations through motor neurons that are going to innervate the heart. And to stimulate cardiac muscle, that's all unconscious, subconscious. And so those motor commands are going to travel through the autonomic nervous system. Now, what branches of the autonomic nervous system are we going to use to get that information there? What color do I want to use here? We're going to send that through the sympathetic neurons. So the cardiac center sends action potentials out the sympathetic nervous system. And what's the sympathetic nervous system going to do to increase blood pressure? Well, to increase blood pressure, we want to increase cardiac output. The more blood going out of the heart, the more cardiac output we have, means that blood pressure is going to go up. So what does the sympathetic nervous system do? It stimulates the SA node. It increases heart rate. What else does it do? It acts on the ventricular myocardium and increases contractility. And when we increase contractility, we increase stroke volume. So by increasing heart rate, by increasing stroke volume, we're increasing cardiac output. We're increasing the amount of blood that's going into the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. And the more blood you have in those arteries, the more blood pressure we're going to have, the higher blood pressure is going to be. Another thing the cardiac center does is it stimulates sympathetic neurons that act on the adrenal gland, and specifically they stimulate the adrenal medulla. And what the adrenal medulla is going to do, it's going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. So we have these circulating hormones in the blood, and what do epinephrine and norepinephrine do? Well, they're going to basically do the same things as the other sympathetic nervous fibers. They're going to act on the ventricular myocardium, and they're going to increase contractility. They're going to increase stroke volume. Now there's another center in the medulla oblongata that's going to be involved in increasing blood pressure, and that's called the vasomotor center. Vaso referring to vessel, and motor in this case referring to contraction or relaxation. So we have the same thing going on. We have these same sensory neurons that send that information about blood pressure, drop in blood pressure, to the medulla, except now they go to this area called the vasomotor center. And the vasomotor center is going to integrate that information and send out motor commands, again, through the sympathetic nervous system. But now, the sympathetic nervous system is going to innervate a different effector organ. It's going to innervate the smooth muscle in the blood vessel walls. And what is it going to cause that smooth muscle to do? It's going to cause it to contract. And when the smooth muscle in blood vessels contract, that causes vasoconstriction. It causes the diameter of the blood vessel to go down. How does that increase blood pressure? Well, the less space you have in there for the blood, the more pressure that blood is going to apply. So another way to increase blood pressure is to vasoconstrict the blood vessels throughout the body. And that's what the vasomotor center is doing. And since we're talking about this, the body's response to low blood pressure, I do want to bring up some other mechanisms that are involved besides the nervous system response. And specifically, the endocrine and the urinary system are going to be involved. And we're going to talk about these in a lot more detail when we talk about the urinary system, but I at least want to preview it here. So the drop in blood pressure is not only going to be detected by baroreceptors for the nervous system, but the kidney is also going to detect that as well. And in response, the kidney is going to activate this whole series of events called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. And basically what's going to happen is the kidney, in response to low blood pressure, is going to release a molecule called renin. Renin is going to be converted to a molecule called angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 2 is going to act on the adrenal gland to cause the release of a hormone called aldosterone. What's aldosterone going to do? Aldosterone is going to act back on the kidney, and it's going to cause the kidney to retain more sodium in the body. Instead of sodium getting eliminated in the urine, it's going to cause the kidney to maintain or to retain that sodium within the blood. And the reason that increases blood pressure is because wherever sodium goes in the body, water follows it. So essentially what aldosterone is doing is it's causing more sodium to stay in the blood and therefore more water to stay in the blood. And so by doing that, the more blood, that increases blood volume and that increases blood pressure. And another thing that's going to happen is when the nervous system detects that drop in blood pressure via those baroreceptors are also going to act on the posterior pituitary. So it's going to act on the posterior pituitary, which again is part of the endocrine system. In response, the posterior pituitary is going to release a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. That antidiuretic hormone is going to act on the kidneys, and what it does is it causes more water to stay in the body. It causes less water to leave the body as urine and more water to stay in the body in the blood. And so again, what you're doing is you're increasing blood volume, and by doing that, you're increasing blood pressure.